Commander Juan sat at his monitoring station, sipping cold coffee and watching the endless stream of galactic communications. It was 3:47 in the morning, and nothing interesting had happened for weeks. The Galactic Council's deep space monitoring post was usually quiet during night shifts. Then the emergency frequency crackled to life. "This is Kepler Colony calling any council vessel." A panicked voice broke through the static. G1 nearly spilled his coffee as he scrambled to boost the signal strength. The voice belonged to Dr. Minho Park, whom G1 recognized from previous routine check-ins. Park always sounded calm and professional during their monthly reports about mining quotas and equipment needs. Not tonight. "We are under attack by unknown vessels." Park's voice shook with terror. "They came out of nowhere. Military ships, definitely not pirates. They're targeting our residential areas first. Women and children are running for the shelters, but the transmission cut to static for several seconds. When it returned, explosions echoed in the background. "Please send help immediately. They're not taking prisoners. They're killing everyone they find, even the kids from the school. Oh God, they're burning the nursery building. Please, anyone listening, we have families here. We have children." Another blast of static, then silence. G1 stared at his communication panel, his hands trembling slightly. In 15 years of monitoring deep space transmissions, he had never heard anything like this. Pirates usually demanded surrender and took valuable supplies. They didn't burn nurseries. Admiral Hunwoo rushed into the monitoring room within minutes, still putting on his uniform jacket. His gray hair was messy from sleep, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "What do we have, G1? "Kepler Colony is under attack, sir." Dr. Park sent a distress call. "It sounds bad, really bad." Hyunwoo leaned over the console as Juan replayed the recording. Both men listened in growing horror as Park's desperate pleas filled the room. When the recording ended, the Admiral was quiet for a long moment. "Any follow-up transmissions?" "Nothing, sir. Complete radio silence for the past 20 minutes." Hyunwoo rubbed his tired eyes. "It's probably raiders looking for their mining equipment. Humans aren't exactly high on the Council's protection list. Small colonies like Kepler are always targets." But something in the recording bothered him. The attackers hadn't demanded surrender or asked for valuable cargo. They had gone straight for the civilian areas. That wasn't normal raider behavior. "Sir, shouldn't we send a rescue fleet immediately?" Hyunwoo sighed. "G1, Kepler is 3 days away at maximum speed. By the time we get there, whatever happened is already over. Besides, the Council barely considers humans worth protecting. They're just another minor species trying to scratch out a living on the galaxy's edge." Despite his casual words, protocol was protocol. The Galactic Council had rules about investigating distress calls, even from unimportant species. Hyunwoo authorized a small reconnaissance fleet to investigate. Kepler Colony. 2 destroyers and a science vessel departed the Council station 2 hours later. Captain Sora commanded the mission, expecting to find the usual aftermath of a pirate raid: some damaged buildings, stolen equipment, and maybe a few casualties. None of them suspected they were about to discover something that would unleash the most terrifying military response the galaxy had ever witnessed. Captain Sora's reconnaissance fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system 3 days after receiving Admiral Hyunwoo's orders. She expected to find some damaged buildings and maybe a few casualties from a typical pirate raid. Nothing had prepared her for what appeared on their scanning screens. Where Kepler Colony should have been, only smoke and debris remained. "Captain," her navigation officer called out, his voice tight with shock. "I'm detecting massive structural damage across the entire settlement. Life signs are almost zero." Sora felt her stomach drop. She had investigated dozens of pirate attacks over her career, but this looked different. Worse, the colony wasn't just damaged, had been completely destroyed. As their ships moved closer, the full horror became visible. The mining colony, that once housed over 400 people, was now nothing but ash and twisted metal. Buildings had been systematically demolished. The school, the medical center, the residential blocks, everything was in ruins. But what made Sora's blood run cold were the bodies. They weren't scattered randomly, like victims of a chaotic battle. Instead, the dead lay in organized rows, lined up with military precision. This wasn't the work of desperate pirates looking for quick profit. This was methodical execution. "Get me those buried data servers," Sora ordered her technical team. "I want to know exactly what happened here." Lieutenant Do-Yan worked frantically to recover surveillance footage from the colony's backup systems. When he finally accessed the files, what he saw made him step back from his console in horror. "Captain, you need to see this." The footage showed the attackers' clearly sleek black ships bearing the symbols of the Vorthok supremacy. Sora knew that emblem well. The Vorthok were a militant empire that had been expanding aggressively across the outer sectors for decades. They enslaved weaker species and eliminated those they considered worthless. But the video showed something far worse than typical conquest. The Vorthok soldiers moved through the colony with cold efficiency, killing every human they encountered. Men, women, elderly, people, didn't matter. They showed no interest in taking prisoners or stealing valuable mining equipment. They simply murdered everyone they found. The most disturbing footage came from the residential areas. Families had tried to hide in their homes, but the Vorthok dragged them out and executed them in the streets. The audio picked up screaming, crying, and desperate pleas for mercy that went unanswered. "They're not even taking the valuable ore," Do-Yan whispered, reviewing the industrial sector footage. "They're just destroying everything and leaving," while the technical team analyzed the surface devastation. Sora's ground team explored the deep mining tunnels beneath the colony. The underground areas had partially collapsed during the attack, creating small pockets where some people might have survived. In the deepest shaft, they found 12 survivors huddled together in a maintenance chamber. Most were miners who had been working underground when the attack began. Among them was a young girl named Yunha, probably 7 or 8 years old, clutching the remains of a small doll. The child's clothes were torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears and dust. When Sora knelt down to speak with her through the translation device, Yuna's words hit her like a physical blow. "They killed everyone," the little girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mommy, Daddy, my baby brother, even the babies from the nursery. Why did they kill the babies?" Sora had seen combat, investigated war crimes, and dealt with the worst aspects of galactic conflict. But looking into this child's traumatized eyes, she felt something break inside her chest. The other survivors told similar stories. The Vorthok had shown no mercy, no interest in negotiation or surrender. They had simply arrived and begun systematically exterminating every human in the colony. Back on her ship, Sora stared at the evidence files she had compiled. Hours of video footage, witness testimonies, and forensic data that painted a clear picture of genocide. "Captain," Lieutenant Do-Yan said quietly, "we have to report this to Earth. The human government needs to know what happened to their people." Sora hesitated. In galactic politics, humans were considered a minor species, not particularly advanced, not especially influential, and certainly not militarily significant. The Galactic Council barely paid attention to human affairs. "What can they possibly do?" she murmured, more to herself than to Do-Yan. "The Vorthok supremacy has one of the most powerful military forces in 3 sectors. Humans barely have enough ships to protect their own core worlds." But looking at the footage of murdered children and the broken doll in little Yuna's arms, Sora knew she couldn't just file this away as another unfortunate incident on the galaxies frontier. She transmitted everything to Earth. Captain Sora had barely finished transmitting her report to Earth when she received new orders from Admiral Hunwu. The Galactic Council wanted her to remain in the Kepler system, to monitor the situation, and provide humanitarian aid to the survivors. She expected it would be a quiet assignment, maybe a few weeks of cleanup work and paperwork. 18 hours later, everything changed. The communication came through on every frequency, simultaneously, cutting through routine traffic across 3 entire sectors of space. The voice was calm, measured, but carried an undertone that made Sora's skin crawl. "This is Admiral Sungjin Kim of the Human Defense Fleet, broadcasting on all channels. Yesterday, the Vorthok Supremacy attacked and destroyed Kepler Colony. Colony contained 437 human beings. Among them were 39 children under the age of 10 years old." Sora sat up straight in her command chair. She had never heard of Admiral Kim before, but something in his tone suggested this wasn't going to be a typical diplomatic protest. The attack was unprovoked. The victims were civilians, miners, teachers, shopkeepers, and their families. They posed no military threat to anyone. They were simply trying to build a life on the frontier. The transmission continued, and Sora noticed something strange happening on her sensor displays. Ships were moving throughout human space, lots of ships. The Vorthok killed every human they could find. Men, women, elderly people, and children. They executed families in their homes. They burned the school. They destroyed the medical center while wounded people were still inside. President Nari of the Galactic Council tried desperately to establish communication with Earth's government. Sora watched the diplomatic channels light up with urgent messages, requests for emergency meetings, and offers to mediate the situation peacefully. All of them went unanswered. Instead, something unprecedented began happening across human space. Military vessels emerged from hidden bases that the Galactic Council didn't even know existed. Ancient battleships that hadn't been seen since the brutal human colonial wars decades ago powered up their engines and left their orbital graveyards. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Cargo haulers, massive industrial ships designed to transport mining equipment and supplies, suddenly appeared on long-range sensors, bristling with hastily mounted weapons. Mining platforms that normally dug asteroids apart were being converted into mobile weapon platforms. Even luxury passenger liners were being retrofitted with military hardware. "Captain," her sensor operator called out nervously, "I'm detecting over 300 human vessels mobilizing across 4 different sectors. This isn't just their regular navy. This is everyone." Sora watched in growing amazement as the human fleet began to move. These weren't the careful, measured movements of a typical military deployment. This was something primal and terrifying, like watching a sleeping giant suddenly wake up and discover someone had hurt its children. The flagship of the human fleet, a massive dreadnought called Retribution, passed directly by Sora's position. She could see smaller vessels, fighters, frigates, and converted civilian craft swarming around it like angry insects. Unable to contain her concern, Sora opened a direct communication channel to Admiral Kim. "Admiral, this is Captain Sora of the Galactic Council Reconnaissance Fleet. The Council is deeply troubled by this mobilization. We urge restraint and measured response. The situation can still be resolved through diplomatic channels. We can negotiate with the Vorthok, establish compensation, maybe even arrange for some of their leadership to face justice." The response came back immediately, and the coldness in Admiral Kim's voice made Sora's blood freeze. "Captain Sora, I appreciate your concern, but the Vorthok Supremacy made their choice when they decided to murder our children. They crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Admiral, please reconsider. Military action will only escalate the situation. The Vorthok have a massive fleet and powerful allies. This could start a galactic war." That Kim's voice cut through her plea like a blade. "They touched our children, Captain, our babies. There are no negotiations. There is no diplomacy. There is only justice." The communication ended abruptly, leaving Sora staring at her blank screen. Around her bridge, the crew worked in stunned silence As hundreds of human vessels streamed past their position, Lieutenant Doyen approached her command chair, his face pale with worry. "Captain, what have we unleashed?" Sora watched the last of the human fleet disappear into hyperspace, heading toward Vorthok territory with deadly purpose. In all her years of galactic service, she had never seen anything like this, an entire species mobilizing for war with the cold efficiency of a natural disaster. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think the galaxy is about to discover what happens when you hurt humanity's young." The Vorthok supremacy had built their empire on fear and overwhelming force. For over 50 years, they had terrorized smaller civilizations across 3 sectors of space, enslaving some species and completely wiping out others. Their military might was legendary: 17 heavily fortified installations, protected by the most advanced weapons technology money could buy. Admiral Sungjin Kim studied the tactical displays aboard his flagship, Retribution, as his fleet approached the first target. Intelligence reports showed that each Vorthok installation housed thousands of soldiers and enough firepower to level entire planets. Any sane military commander would approach such targets with extreme caution, probably spending months planning each assault. Kim wasn't feeling particularly sane. He divided his forces with surgical precision. Each human battle group would hit a different Vorthok stronghold simultaneously, preventing them from coordinating their defenses or calling for reinforcement. It was an incredibly risky strategy that required perfect timing and absolute commitment. "Remember," Kim broadcast to all his ship commanders, "these are the same creatures who murdered children at Kepler Colony. Show them exactly the same mercy they showed our families." Captain Young-ho received orders to assault Vorthok Station Prime, the enemy's most heavily defended fortress. His battle group consisted of 12 destroyers, 30 frigates, and over 100 converted civilian vessels crewed by volunteers. On paper, they were completely outmatched by the station's defensive systems. The battle began at 600 hours and lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. What happened during those 4 hours shocked every military observer in 3 sectors. The human ships didn't just attack, they swarmed the station like angry hornets, accepting massive casualties to get close enough for devastating short-range strikes. Converted cargo haulers rammed directly into defensive gun emplacements. Mining ships used their industrial cutting lasers to slice through the station's armor plating. When the smoke cleared, Vorthok Station Prime was a drifting hulk. Every single defender was dead. Young-ho's after-action report was coldly professional. Target eliminated. No enemy survivors. Proceeding to secondary objectives. Meanwhile, Colonel Minji led the ground assault on Zarian mining platform, a massive facility built into an asteroid. Her troops had trained for this mission during the 3-day journey from Earth, practicing room-to-room combat and studying the platform's layout. Galactic Council observers monitoring the assault watched in growing horror as Minji's soldiers moved through the facility with terrifying precision. Every shot was calculated. Every movement was purposeful. They showed no emotion, no hesitation, no mercy. "They're not fighting like normal soldiers," reported Council observer Tai Wu from his monitoring ship. "They're fighting like machines programmed for one purpose: elimination of all enemy forces." The human troops cleared the entire mining platform in 6 hours. Like at Station Prime, no Vorthok survived. Similar scenes played out across Vorthok territory as human forces struck with coordinated fury. The Krolex defense grid fell in 18 hours. Fort Zareth lasted less than a day. The supposedly impregnable Blackstone Fortress was reduced to floating debris within 48 hours. The Vorthok commanders couldn't understand what was happening. These humans had appeared from nowhere with jury-rigged equipment and converted civilian ships. Yet they fought with an intensity that defied military logic. They seemed completely willing to die if it meant killing their enemies. What the Vorthok didn't understand was that humanity wasn't just fighting a war. They were avenging their murdered children. Within 2 weeks, 16 of the 17 Vorthok military installations were smoking ruins. The mighty supremacy that had terrorized the galaxy for decades was being systematically dismantled by a species they had considered beneath notice. President Nari of the Galactic Council sent increasingly desperate messages to Admiral Kim, begging him to stop the slaughter. Admiral Kim, your forces are violating 17 different galactic warfare conventions. You're executing prisoners, targeting civilian infrastructure, and using excessive force against defeated enemies. Kim's reply came back within hours, and its simplicity chilled every council member who heard it. President Nari, we never signed your conventions. We never agreed to your rules. The Vorthok chose to play by the law of the jungle when they murdered our children. We're simply playing by the same rules. The hunt continued relentlessly. Vorthok's supply convoys disappeared without trace. Their communication networks went silent. Their patrol fleets simply vanished. For the first time in their history, the Vorthok supremacy, the terror of 3 sectors, found themselves being hunted by an enemy they had fatally underestimated. They had awakened something ancient and primal in humanity, something that wouldn't stop until every last one of them was dead. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as the hunters became the hunted. Supreme Commander Thaxel stood on the bridge of his flagship Dominator, watching the final preparations for what he believed would be humanity's last stand. Over the past 2 weeks, he had witnessed the impossible, his mighty military installations falling one by one to these primitive humans who shouldn't have posed any real threat. But now, surrounded by the combined might of the entire Armada, he felt confident again. Status report, he barked to his tactical officer. All fleet elements are in position, Supreme Commander. 2,947 vessels form a defensive sphere around Vorthok Prime. Our defensive satellites are fully operational. Ground-based planetary cannons are ready to fire. Thaxel nodded grimly. This was every ship the Vorthok supremacy possessed: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, fighters, and support vessels, all drawn back from across their empire to protect the homeworld. He had never assembled such a massive force before. Sir? His communications officer interrupted. We're detecting hyperspace distortions at the system's edge. Multiple contacts emerging. How many ships? Thaxel demanded. The officer's face went pale as he studied his readings. I can't get an accurate count, sir. There are too many signatures. Through the massive viewing ports of his command bridge, Thaxel watched in growing amazement as the human fleet materialized from hyperspace. Ships emerged in waves, dozens, then hundreds, then more than his sensors could properly track. But these weren't the sleek military vessels he expected. Admiral Kim's official Navy ships were there, certainly destroyers and cruisers bearing the insignia of the human defense fleet. But surrounding them was something far more terrifying. An armada of civilian vessels that had been transformed into instruments of war. Massive cargo haulers, designed to transport goods between star systems, now bristled with hastily welded weapon mounts. Industrial mining ships that normally broke apart asteroids carried experimental military hardware that glowed with dangerous energy. Even luxury passenger liner ships meant for peaceful tourism had been converted into makeshift aircraft carriers, launching swarms of fighters. By the void, whispered Thaxel, second in command. It's not just their military, it's their entire civilization. The human fleet continued, emerging from hyperspace for nearly an hour. Construction vessels, research ships, transport craft, refinery platforms, everything that could mount a weapon or carry troops had been pressed into service. Thaxel realized with growing horror that he wasn't facing a professional military force. He was facing an entire species that had mobilized for total war. Captain Wanho commanded one of the most unusual vessels in the human fleet, the Soul's Pride, a converted heavy freight hauler that had spent decades carrying mining equipment to frontier colonies. Now its cargo bays housed missile launchers. Its hull was reinforced with military-grade armor, and its crew consisted of volunteer miners and factory workers who had never seen combat before today. As the human fleet took battle positions, Wanho opened a direct communication channel to the Vorthok Armada. His voice carried across space to every enemy ship in the system. "Attention Vorthok forces. This is Captain Wanho of the human vessel Soul's Pride. 3 weeks ago, your people attacked Kepler Colony. You murdered 437 innocent civilians. You killed 39 children. You burned down schools and hospitals." The communication channel crackled with static as thousands of Vorthok officers listened in stunned silence. "We are not your military. We are not your government. We are parents, workers, teachers, and shopkeepers. We are ordinary people who came here for one simple reason. You killed our children, and we've come to return the favor." Thaxel tried to respond, but Wanho's transmission continued. "You have 30 minutes to surrender unconditionally and submit to human justice. If you refuse, we will show you exactly the same mercy you showed the families at Kepler Colony." The channel went silent. Across the Vorthok fleet, officers looked to their supreme commander for orders. Thaxel stared at the tactical display, showing the enormous human force surrounding his homeworld. Despite their improvised appearance, these ships moved with military precision and obvious deadly intent. "Sir," his tactical officer said nervously, "they still outnumber us significantly, but our ships are purpose-built warships with superior firepower and armor. We have the advantage of advantage." Thaxel laughed bitterly. "Look at them. They brought their entire civilization to kill us. These aren't soldiers following orders, they're parents seeking revenge for murdered children." He studied the human fleet formation and realized something that chilled him to the bone. These people weren't expecting to survive this battle. They had come prepared to die if necessary to destroy every Vorthok in the system. The 30-minute deadline approached rapidly. Thaxel knew he had two choices: surrender his entire species to human justice, or fight a battle against an enemy that showed no fear of death. The battle for Vorthok Prime was about to begin, and for the first time in his military career, Thaxel wasn't sure his side could win. The battle began exactly 30 minutes after Captain Wanho's ultimatum expired. Supreme Commander Thaxel had chosen to fight rather than surrender, believing his superior numbers and firepower would eventually overwhelm the human fleet. He could not have been more wrong. The engagement that followed wasn't a typical space battle with careful maneuvering and strategic positioning. It was pure, unleashed fury that lasted 37 hours of continuous combat. Lieutenant Colonel Yemen led the first wave of human fighters, piloting a converted mining scout that had been hastily fitted with military weapons. His squadron of 64 pilots included former cargo hauler captains, asteroid miners, and even a few civilian flight instructors who had volunteered for the mission. What made them terrifying wasn't their equipment, it was their motivation. Each pilot had installed small display screens in their cockpits showing footage recovered from Kepler Colony. As they flew into battle, they watched images of the murdered families, the burned school, the executed children. The faces of 7-year-old Yunha and dozens of other victims stared back at them from their targeting displays. "Remember why we're here," Yemen broadcast to his squadron as they approached the Vorthok defensive line. "Every shot we fire is for those kids who will never go home." The human fighters didn't attack like trained military pilots following careful tactics. They swarmed through the Vorthok formations like angry insects, accepting massive casualties to get close enough for devastating strikes. When their weapons ran out, some pilots deliberately crashed their ships into enemy vessels. Captain Su Yang commanded the destroyer Vengeance, one of the few purpose-built military ships in the human fleet. Her vessel had been named after the concept driving every human in the battle: pure, focused revenge for innocent victims. For 6 hours, The Vengeance exchanged fire with a massive Vorthok battlecruiser called the Iron Fist. Both ships absorbed tremendous damage, their armor plates glowing red-hot from repeated energy strikes. When Su Yang's weapons finally ran dry and her engines began failing, she made a decision that shocked even her own crew. "All hands, abandon ship immediately," she announced over the ship's intercom. "Escape pods launch in 60 seconds. Her tactical officer stared at her in confusion. "Captain, we can still retreat and rearm." Su Yang looked at the image of murdered children displayed on her command screen, then at the enemy battlecruiser that was preparing to finish them off. "No retreat. We came here to destroy these monsters, and that's exactly what we're going to do." She aimed her crippled destroyer directly at the Iron Fist and pushed the engines to maximum power. The Vengeance slammed into the enemy vessel at full speed, both ships exploding in a brilliant fireball that lit up the battlefield. Su Yang and her crew escaped in pods just before impact, floating in space as they watched their target burn. Other human vessels quickly picked them up, and within hours, Su Yang was commanding a converted cargo hauler. Continuing the fight, Admiral Sung Jin Kim coordinated the massive battle from his flagship Retribution, maintaining constant communication with hundreds of ship captains across the sprawling engagement. His voice remained eerily calm throughout the 37 hours of combat, directing the systematic destruction of the Vorthok fleet with cold precision. "Target their command vessels. First," he instructed his captains. "I want their leaders to watch their empire die before they join it." The human fleet focused their attacks on Vorthok headquarters ships, communication vessels, and supply craft. They weren't just trying to win a battle, they were deliberately dismantling the enemies. Ability to coordinate or retreat. Galactic Council monitoring stations throughout the system recorded every moment of the engagement, broadcasting the footage to shocked observers across multiple sectors. President Nari watched from her command center as the species she had dismissed as peaceful traders and miners demonstrated a capacity for organized violence that terrified her. "This isn't the humanity we knew," she whispered to her advisors. "These aren't the same people who sent us polite trade requests and mining permits." The humans fighting around Vorthok Prime showed no interest in following conventional rules of warfare. They targeted wounded ships, ignored surrender signals, and continued attacking even when their own vessels were critically damaged. It was primal, terrifying, and absolutely unstoppable. By hour 24, half the Vorthok fleet was destroyed or disabled. By hour 30, Supreme Commander Thaxel realized his forces were doomed. By hour 47, the once mighty Vorthok armada existed only as floating debris around their homeworld. The battle was over. The Vorthok supremacy terror of 3 sectors for 50 years had been completely annihilated by an enemy they had dismissed as insignificant. The galaxy would never underestimate humanity again. With the last Vorthok warship reduced to glowing debris, an eerie silence fell over the homeworld system. For the first time in centuries, Vorthok Prime floated in space completely defenseless, its massive planetary shields down and its orbital defense platforms destroyed. Admiral Sung Jin Kim surveyed the battlefield from his flagship bridge, watching as human vessels took strategic positions around the planet. Hundreds of ships formed a perfect blockade, military destroyers, converted cargo haulers, mining platforms, and civilian craft all working together to ensure nothing could leave or enter the system. Establish communications with the planetary government. Kim ordered his communications officer. The transmission went out on all frequencies, reaching every radio, television, and data network across Vorthok Prime. Kim's voice echoed through government buildings, military bunkers, civilian homes, and refugee shelters. "This is Admiral Kim of the Human Defense Fleet. Your military forces are completely destroyed. Your planet is surrounded and defenseless. You have exactly 1 hour to surrender unconditionally and submit to human justice for the genocide committed at Kepler Colony." In the deepest military bunker, beneath the planet's capital city, Supreme Commander Thaxel stared at his communication screens in growing panic. His once mighty empire had been reduced to ruins in less than a month. The humans hadn't just defeated his military, they had systematically exterminated every Vorthok force they encountered. "Sir," his aide whispered nervously, "what are your orders?" Thaxel looked around the bunker at his remaining officers. These were the survivors of a military that had once terrorized 3 sectors of space, now reduced to hiding underground, like frightened animals. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the communication channels. President Nari of the Galactic Council, broadcasting an emergency transmission from her headquarters. "Admiral Kim, I'm speaking on behalf of the entire Galactic Council. You cannot blockade an inhabited planet. There are over 6 billion civilians on Vorthok Prime, men, women, children, and elderly people who had nothing to do with the attack on your colony." Kim's response came back immediately, and the coldness in his tone made every council member listening feel a chill run down their spine. President Nari, the Vorthok supremacy murdered 437 innocent humans, including 39 children. Every Vorthok citizen contributed to that decision through their silence, their support, or their participation in a government built on genocide and terror. "Admiral, please be reasonable. You're talking about billions of innocent people." "Innocent?" Kim's voice carried a bitter laugh. "For 50 years, the Vorthok have enslaved and exterminated dozens of species across 3 sectors. Where were these innocent civilians when their government was committing those atrocities? Where were their protests, their resistance, their objections?" President Nari tried desperately to interrupt, but Kim continued. "They cheered when their military brought back slaves from conquered worlds. They celebrated when inferior species were wiped out to make room for Vorthok expansion. They elected leaders who promised them an empire built on the bones of weaker civilizations." The transmission paused for a moment before Kim delivered his final judgment. "They made this choice when they decided our children were acceptable casualties. Now they will live with the consequences." Down on the planet's surface, desperate Vorthok officials tried everything they could think of to break the human resolve. Supreme Commander Thaxel sent increasingly frantic surrender offers, promises of war, reparations, agreements to disband the military, offers to turn over war criminals for trial. Kim rejected every single offer without negotiation. Captain Jisoo commanded the converted orbital platform Justice, one of the larger vessels maintaining the blockade. Her ship had originally been a civilian space station used for asteroid mining, but now it bristled with weapons and housed hundreds of volunteers who had come to avenge Kepler colony. "Admiral," she reported during the daily briefing, are broadcasting continuous transmissions showing their own civilian population. Families, children, elderly people. They're trying to appeal to our sympathy." Through the viewing ports of the Justice, Jisoo could see the lights of major cities on the planet below. Millions of people going about their daily lives, unaware that their government's actions had doomed them all. Kim's response was immediate and unwavering. "Captain Jisoo, they should have considered the safety of their own families before they decided to murder ours. If they were truly concerned about Vorthok children, they wouldn't have taught them to celebrate the deaths of alien children." The blockade continued without mercy. No ships entered or left the system. No supplies reached the planet. No communication with the outside galaxy was permitted. The Galactic Council sent diplomatic missions, offered to mediate negotiations, and even threatened economic sanctions against human colonies. All of their efforts were ignored across 3 sectors of space. Other aggressive species watched the situation with growing alarm. The peaceful humans, the traders, miners, and colonists they had dismissed as harmless had revealed themselves capable of systematic, implacable revenge. The message was clear: harm human children, and face the wrath of an entire civilization that would not stop, would not negotiate, and would not show mercy until justice was served. The galaxy learned to fear humanity's protective instincts. After 3 months of total isolation, the Vorthok homeworld was dying. The orbital blockade had prevented all trade, supplies, and communication with the outside galaxy. Food shortages plagued the major cities. Power grids failed as fuel supplies ran out. Medical centers closed when critical medicines couldn't be imported. In his deep underground bunker, Supreme Commander Thaxel watched his empire crumble through security cameras positioned across the planet. The mighty Vorthok supremacy that had terrorized 3 sectors for decades was collapsing without a single human soldier setting foot on their world. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving surrender offers from 17 different planetary governors. The outer colonies are declaring independence. The military command structure is completely broken." Thaxel stared at the tactical displays that once showed thousands of Vorthok warships spread across conquered territory. Now those screens showed nothing but empty space patrolled by human vessels. "What about our allies?" he asked desperately. "The Krolex Empire, the Zarian Federation." His aide looked uncomfortable. "Sir, they've all declared neutrality. No one wants to face the humans after what happened to our fleet." The reality was undeniable. The Vorthok supremacy had been utterly defeated by a species they had dismissed as harmless farmers and miners. Rather than face capture and trial for war crimes, Thaxel made his final choice. His body was found the next morning in his private quarters. With their government collapsed and their military destroyed, millions of Vorthok became refugees overnight. Some fled to distant colonies that hadn't been blockaded. Others sought asylum in neutral territories. Most ended up in overcrowded refugee camps scattered across the galaxy, dependent on charity from the same species they had once enslaved or threatened. The psychological impact on other aggressive civilizations was immediate and profound. The Malachite Consortium, which had been planning to invade 3 peaceful systems, suddenly cancelled their military expansion. The Draconian Empire recalled their raiding fleets and opened diplomatic channels with their neighbors. Across the galaxy, species that had built their power on conquering weaker civilizations began reconsidering their strategies. Humanity had demonstrated that attacking civilians carried a terrible price that no military could afford to pay. Colonel Hayagi received orders to establish permanent monitoring stations throughout the former Vorthok territory. Her fleet of converted ships and volunteer crews set up bases on abandoned military platforms and strategic asteroid fields. "Our mission is simple," she announced to her officers during the first briefing. "We're here to make sure nothing like Kepler Colony ever happens again. Any species that targets civilian populations, enslaves innocents, or commits genocide will answer to humanity." The monitoring stations weren't just military outposts, they were symbols. Every aggressive species in 3 sectors could see them and understand the message. Humanity was watching, and they would not tolerate attacks on innocent people. The Galactic Council tried desperately to reassert their authority over the changing political landscape. President Nari convened emergency sessions to discuss war crimes tribunals and restoration of proper diplomatic protocols. Their efforts failed completely. When council investigators tried to access former Vorthok worlds to document war crimes, they found human patrol ships blocking their path. When trade convoys attempted to bypass human checkpoints, their cargo was inspected and their routes were monitored. When diplomatic missions tried to negotiate new agreements, they discovered that major shipping lanes were now controlled by human vessels. "This is unprecedented," President Nari complained during a heated council session. "Humanity has no legal authority to control galactic trade routes." But legal authority mattered less than practical power, and humanity now controlled the military strength that backed up their decisions. Captain Taehoon commanded the patrol ship Guardian, a converted mining vessel that had been retrofitted with sensors and communication equipment. His job was to monitor traffic through the Nexus shipping corridor, one of the busiest trade routes in the galaxy. When a council delegation demanded to know by what right humans controlled galactic commerce, his response was refreshingly honest. "We don't want to rule the galaxy," Tae-hoon explained patiently. "We never asked to be the galactic police force. We just want to make sure that what happened to Kepler colony never happens to anyone else's children. But you're interfering with legitimate trade and diplomatic relations." Tae-hoon gestured toward the tactical display showing the peaceful flow of merchant vessels through the corridor. "How exactly are we interfering? Ships travel freely, trade continues normally, and diplomatic missions proceed without problems. The only difference is that genocidal maniacs can't use these routes to transport weapons for attacking innocent people." The council representatives had no response. Humanity had become the galaxy's apex predator not through conquest or domination, but through their demonstrated willingness to protect the innocent at any cost. Other species learned to adjust to the new reality. Aggressive empires found their expansion plans blocked by human monitoring stations. Pirates discovered that attacking civilian ships brought swift retaliation from human patrol fleets. Slavers realized that their traditional hunting grounds were now protected by people who would hunt them in return. The galaxy had gained a new protector, one motivated not by politics or profit, but by the simple desire to keep children safe. Humanity had not sought this responsibility, but they had accepted it completely. 1 year after the destruction of the original settlement, New Kepler colony bustled with life and activity. Where once there had been only ash and twisted metal, now stood modern buildings, thriving gardens, and the sounds of children playing in safe playgrounds. The colony had been rebuilt larger and stronger than before, with advanced defensive systems and a permanent human defense fleet garrison. Families who had lost everything in the original attack now watched their surviving children grow up in a community that would never again be left defenseless. At the heart of the new settlement stood a simple but powerful memorial. Black stone walls displayed the names of all 437 victims of the Vorthok attack. The adults' names were carved in silver lettering, but the 39 children who had died were remembered in gold that caught the sunlight and seemed to glow with warmth. Little Yunha, now 8 years old, and one of the few survivors of the original colony, visited the memorial every morning before school. She would touch the golden letters, spelling out her parents' names, and whisper quiet promises that she would never forget them. The memorial had become a pilgrimage site for humans throughout the galaxy. Families traveled from distant colonies just to stand before the golden names and understand why their species had changed forever in the span of a few terrible months. On the anniversary of the attack, Fleet Commander Sung-Jin Kim stood before the Galactic Assembly for the first time. Since the war began, he had been promoted after successfully demonstrating humanity's capacity for both protection and terrible vengeance. Now he faced representatives from over 400 different species, all of whom had learned to view humans with a mixture of respect and wariness. The Great Assembly Hall had never been so quiet. Usually, the sessions were filled with diplomatic chatter, side conversations, and the usual political maneuvering. Today, every representative sat in complete silence as Kim approached the speaker's platform. He wore a simple military uniform without decorations or ceremony. The man who had orchestrated the systematic destruction of the Vorthok supremacy looked like any other career officer, but everyone in the hall understood the terrible power he represented. "Honored representatives," Kim began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, "I stand before you today not as a conqueror or as a threat, but as a father and a protector of families." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Humanity has never desired to rule the galaxy. We don't want your worlds, your resources, or your submission. We want something much simpler, the right to raise our children in safety, to build our communities in peace, and to trade freely with our neighbors." Several representatives nodded in understanding, But Kim's expression remained serious. We are traders by nature. We are explorers, builders, teachers, and dreamers. We prefer negotiation to warfare, cooperation to conflict, and friendship to fear. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the assembled delegates. But understand this, we remember Kepler Colony. We remember Dr. Minho Park, who died trying to protect his people. We remember Teacher Hannah, who was killed while shielding her students. We remember little Junwoo, who was only 3 years old, when the Vorthok murdered him in his own home. The silence in the hall deepened. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably as they recalled the footage of human fury that had shocked the galaxy. We remember every face, every name, every child who died there. These memories are carved into our collective soul just as deeply as their names are carved into our memorial. Kim's voice grew quieter, but somehow more menacing. So, let this message reach every corner of the galaxy, every military commander, every aggressive empire that believes strength gives them the right to prey upon the innocent. He stood perfectly still, but his presence seemed to fill the entire chamber. Touch our young again, threaten our colonies, harm our people in any way, and we will show you why the apex predators of Earth, the lions, the sharks, the great hunters of our world, learned to fear what emerged from the darkness of human caves. The assembly remained frozen in absolute silence for nearly a minute after Kim finished speaking. The weight of humanity's demonstrated wrath hung heavy in the air. Finally, President Nari found her voice. The Galactic Assembly acknowledges humanity's message and commits to ensuring the safety of all civilian populations. Kim nodded once, then walked from the platform without another word. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Humanity desired peace above all else, but they had proven beyond any doubt the terrible price that would be paid by anyone foolish enough to deny them that peace. The children of Kepler Colony would never be forgotten, and their deaths had forever changed the balance of power among the stars.